Have you ever tried to write a novel and reached about the middle point of your novel, or maybe like the first third, and lost your motivation to write because you got really overwhelmed, because you're not really sure where the book is going, and you know what the vibe is, and you know who the characters want to be, but you're not entirely sure what's supposed to happen in your novel, and then you go on YouTube and you watch videos and people tell you that maybe you should plot the novel, so you try plotting out the entire novel, but then you find that you lose all motivation to write the novel and it no longer feels exciting to you, and then you never finish the novel, then this is the video for you. In writing, people usually fall on some kind of spectrum between being a plotter and a pantser. If you're a plotter, you like to figure out everything that there is to know about your book. You want to know who the characters are, you want to know all the conversations they have, you want to know every single plot point, you want to know every single scene, and you can't write until you know all of these things. And if you're a pantser, you like to not have an outline and discover as you're writing and fly by the seat of your pants, because outlines stress you out and kill the joy that you have for writing. Most writers fall somewhere on the spectrum between plotter and pantser. Most people aren't a 100% plotter or 100% pantser. They do a little bit of both. If you fall somewhere on the spectrum and you're not a full-on plotter, but you also do want to have a little bit more structure than absolutely no structure at all, then I'm going to give you 5 strategies for ways that you can outline for people who don't like outlining. If my earlier description felt like you're probably not a full-on plotter, but you're also not a full-on pantser. You might need just a tiny bit more structure than completely pantsing your novel would offer you. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 5 ways that you can outline your book for writers who don't like outlining. I'm a plotter, so all of this is coming from somebody who loves to plot out their books, but maybe you'll find something in here that's helpful, or at least could be something fun to try. So the first method I would suggest for people who don't like to plot but want to try plotting anyway is the story arc method. When I think about a story, I like to think of it as looking something like this. This chart has time on the horizontal axis and conflict/tension on the vertical axis. So as the story progresses, your tension goes up until it kind of hits the knee in the curve and then resolves itself. You probably already know every story has conflict, and it has a character who wants something and a character who's standing in their way, and they are fighting with each other, or these two things are in conflict for the entirety of the book until they finally come to a head in the climax, and then they resolve themselves. That rising tension is just the conflict getting more and more intense until it finally comes to a head. You can chart plot points on this story arc, but one method that you can do if you want just a tiny bit more structure, and this is probably the most minimalistic you can get, is just figuring out what your beginning, middle, and end of your story is. The beginning is where you introduce your main character, everything gets set up in the ordinary world, you figure out exactly what it is that is your conflict, like you figure out what your conflict is and when your character first brushes up to it. Your middle is where your conflict really starts to build and your protagonist and antagonist are kind of fighting with each other. The ending is where your protagonist and antagonist fight for the biggest, most important time. For example, let's say you're writing a book, a romance novel, about a girl who moves to a small town and meets a very, very handsome cowboy. In the beginning, your girl would meet the cowboy. Maybe they'd have a meet cute, they go on their first date. And in the middle, maybe they're starting to date and things are going really well and they're getting serious when all of a sudden the ranch that he's working for wants to buy your grandfather's family property that you've lived on your whole life. At the end, maybe this was gonna break up the cowboy and you, but you and the cowboy figure out how to save your grandfather's farm, and you end up falling in love, or they end up falling in love again. That, in very broad strokes, is an outline. That is the beginning, middle, and end of your story. You don't need to know what scenes happen, but you know generally what the overarching thing that is happening in each third of the book is. You can get a little more specific with it. I have 5 plot points that I always start with when I start plotting out my books. Those are the point of entry, the inciting incident, the midpoint, the climax, and the resolution. Point of entry is the point that you first meet the main character. The inciting incident is where the story really starts and the conflict happens. The midpoint is the big plot twist in the middle of the book that changes the stakes. The climax is the ultimate final confrontation, and the resolution is the ending. You can chart these out on the story arc and figure out those plot points. So for our cowboy romance, it would probably be like point of entry is you meet the girl as she moves to a small town. Inciting incident, she meets the cowboy. Midpoint, she realizes that the ranch she's working for is trying to buy her grandfather's farm, and that throws a wrench in their relationship. The climax is when she and the cowboy save the grandpa's farm and they fall in love again, or like reaffirm their commitment, or just like maybe they had broken up and all of a sudden they get back together. The resolution, they live happily ever after. Second outlining method I would recommend for people who do not really like to plot is just figuring out the ending. Forget all of the story arc stuff. You don't need to know anything else except for how your story ends. Like, not just figuring out the happily ever after, because if you're writing a romance, they usually end in happily ever afters. This doesn't tell you much about your story, but figuring out the climax. Like, if you know the general conflict is going to be like she wants to fall in love with this cowboy, but he's working at a rival ranch, that's going to be the general conflict. Like, she's in love with him, but she also knows that he works for a bad ranch and really wants to save her family first, but she also has feelings for him, and so she's conflicted. Figure out, is she going to get back together with the cowboy? Is the ranch going to end up being sold to the other ranch, or like is her grandfather's farm going to be sold to the neighboring ranch? How is she going to end up saving the farm with the cowboy? And once you figure out those details, you know where you're going. You might not necessarily know how you're going to get there, but at least it gives you a general picture in mind for what the stakes are, what the conflicts are, and how your characters are ultimately going to be put to the test in the climax. A lot of people love this method, some people don't, but this is probably the one that I hear about the most. Like, if people say, I don't like plotting, people usually say, just figure out the ending. And it can be very useful, so I figured I would include it on this list. The next plotting method that I would recommend is just figuring out the conflict. Let's say you don't want to know the ending, you don't ultimately know how your conflict's going to come to a head, but you do know what your conflict is. And that is really the most important thing that you need to know when you're writing a story, because all story is conflict. You can't have a story without some really juicy conflict. Like a book where you have a girl and a guy and they fall in love and they start dating and they live happily ever after is not very interesting. If that's all the book is, like they just go on dates and they're happy, it's not interesting. But a book where a girl and a guy go on dates and are really happy, and then she all of a sudden goes to school one day and realizes that he's her teacher, is a lot more juicy. That gives you some conflict, and that makes you want to keep reading. So maybe what doesn't excite you is knowing all the different scenes that are going to happen and knowing exactly how the conflict's going to resolve itself. But if you figure out what the problem is, like girl is in love with boy, but boy is teacher, that's a problem. You can follow that and figure out what the natural escalation of that will be and discover what your climax is while you're writing. That gives you some structure to work within as you're discovering your story. Personally, this would not be enough for me, but none of these would be enough for me because I love to plot, so take that with a grain of salt. Another micro outlining technique is just figure out your antagonist. This is mostly a recommendation for thrillers or mysteries, but if you're writing like a serial killer mystery or like some sort of Criminal Minds type story where there's an antagonist and your character is a detective and trying to solve the case, if you don't want to outline, which is hard in genres like this, especially when you have to deal with clues, figuring out who your antagonist is and why they are doing the things that they are doing can also give your novel structure. I find it virtually impossible to write a mystery about a killer that I do not understand before I start to write, because otherwise you get really lost in the clues and the motivations, and you're simultaneously trying to figure out what the mystery is while also coming up with the mystery. It's not like you're trying to write characters solving a mystery that you're also trying to create at the same time, and that just becomes too confusing. For me anyway, but hats off to you if you can do it. But understanding your antagonist can give you structure if you're a pantser and also writing in a genre like that that's very antagonist behavior dependent. This may not work as well for a romance novel or a coming of age story, but it works really well in those kind of thriller mystery type books. Because if you have an antagonist and you understand them and you know why they're doing the things that they're doing in a mystery context, like you understand why they are killing, then it's easier for you to write from the points of view of characters who are figuring out things that you already know, instead of trying to do two things at once. And the last outlining technique that I would recommend for people who don't like to outline is just character. Don't plot anything, don't come up with any scenes, still come up with your conflict, because I really don't see how you can write a book without understanding what your conflict is. But focus on your characters. Create characters that really come alive to you, spend some time with them, understand who they are as people. I personally find it really difficult to create characters before I start to write, because a lot of the times the plot and book dictates who the characters need to be, so I need to do these things in tandem. But I also know writers who really like creating characters before they start writing. But if you understand your characters and how they would react to things, a lot of writing is cause and effect. It's really important for your writing to be cause and effect, like your characters do something and then something happens, and then they do something else in reaction to that and something else happens. You don't want things to just happen to your character. They need to be creating the things that happen to them. So if you understand who they are and how they would react to things, then it gives you a framework for how to approach cause and effect, because you better understand what they would do in different situations, which allows you to write a cause and effect narrative. So that's it for this short video on some recommendations for outlines that you can try if you hate plotting. I hope that it was interesting or gave you some fun things to try or experiment with if you are a pantser or still trying to figure out where you are in the plotter to pantser spectrum. All of these things on this list would not work for me as a sole plotting technique. I am a lot more involved in my own plotting process. If you're interested in learning more about how I personally plot my own books, I made a video on it and I've linked it in the description of this one if you're interested in checking it out. Where do you lie on the plotter to pantser spectrum? Are you more of a plotter? Are you more of a pantser? Are you 70-30? Are you 80-20? Let me know down in the comments, or if you're also still figuring it out. It took me many years of writing and experimentation to figure out my own process, and so trust me when I say I know it takes a long time to figure out exactly what works for you and where you really are on the plotter to pantser spectrum. If you have a second, I'd be super grateful if you could like this video and also subscribe to my channel. My name is Claire Fraze, and I'm an award-winning author who makes videos on this channel sharing actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I'm the author of the paranormal thriller They Stay series. Those are my books over there, which tell the story of a 16-year-old girl whose younger brother goes missing and was kidnapped by this evil necromancer who wants to put some other kid's ghost and bring him back to life inside his body, and so she and 3 other outcasts from her school have to team up to solve this creepy mystery and stop the old necromancer before it's too late. So if this sounds up your alley, go check out my books. They're linked in the description below. I hope you have a fantastic week, everybody, and as always, happy writing.